When did the entire volleyball team forfeit the championship game? The referee blew his whistle at 6:47 p.m. on a Saturday in March, calling both teams to center court for the national championship match. The gymnasium at the convention center held 8,000 people, every seat filled, the crowd roaring with anticipation. We were the Riverside High Spartans, undefeated all season, ranked first in the state, favored to win by every sports analyst who'd covered our run. Our opponents, the Westfield Academy Tigers, stood on their side of the net in their crisp white uniforms, stretching and mentally preparing. On our side, 12 players stood in a circle, our captain's bands visible on my arm and on Leo Castellanos, our setter. Coach Graham Novak stood 20 feet away, his clipboard under his arm, his expression confident and commanding. He had no idea what was about to happen. The referee asked for team captains to approach for the coin toss. Leo and I exchanged one look, a silent confirmation that we were really doing this. Then we walked to center court. But instead of shaking hands with the opposing captains, I turned to the referee and said clearly into the silence, "Riverside High forfeits this match. We will not play." The gymnasium went from deafening noise to absolute stunned silence in less than 2 seconds. Then chaos erupted. I'd been playing volleyball since I was 11 years old, when my older sister dragged me to an open gym, and I discovered I loved the sport more than anything else in my life. By the time I was a freshman at Riverside, I was 6'3", athletic, and had spent years developing skills that made me one of the top hitters in the region. Coach Novak had recruited me personally, visiting my family's house, showing us his program statistics, his wall of championship banners, his professional connections that had sent dozens of players to Division I colleges. He'd coached at Riverside for 18 years, built the program from nothing into a powerhouse, won 4 state championships, and had a reputation as a developer of talent and a mentor of young men. Parents loved him. The administration worshipped him. Players trusted him completely. I was no exception. When he told me I could be All-American if I dedicated myself to his training program, I believed him. When he said Riverside could win nationals with me as team captain my senior year, I worked harder than I'd ever worked at anything. The team was special that year. Leo had transferred from California and brought elite-level setting skills. Our middle blockers, twins named Devin and Damon Wright, were 6'7" and nearly impossible to score on. Our libero, a junior named Isaiah Kim, could dig anything. Our outside hitters, Carlos Ruiz and Jaden Foster, were explosive and consistent. The bench was deep with talented sophomores and juniors who pushed us in practice. We had chemistry, skill, and a hunger to prove ourselves. Volleyball wasn't a major sport at most schools, but at Riverside, it was respected because Coach Novak had made it respected. He'd turned boys volleyball into something the community cared about, packed our home matches, got local media coverage. We were celebrities in our small way, recognized in hallways, featured in the school paper, treated like the football team at schools where football mattered. Coach Novak was intense, but seemingly supportive. He ran brutal practices, 3 hours after school 5 days a week, plus weekend tournaments and individual skill sessions. He demanded excellence, but framed it as bringing out our potential. He had rules. No social media during season, no dating that could cause team drama, mandatory study halls twice weekly, drug testing whenever he felt like it, complete availability for his training schedule. Looking back, the control was excessive, but at the time, it felt like discipline, like what serious athletes accepted. He told us constantly that we were his legacy, that our success was his success, that he was preparing us for life beyond volleyball by teaching us commitment and sacrifice. I bought into it completely. So did everyone else. The first crack in that belief came in early February, about 6 weeks before nationals. One of our starting outside hitters, a senior named Marcus, no, I need to avoid that name. One of our starters, a senior named Trevor Huang, collapsed during practice. Just went down mid-drill, unconscious before he hit the floor. Coach Novak immediately took charge, called 911, moved everyone back, did all the right things. The ambulance came within 8 minutes. Trevor was taken to Memorial Hospital. We were told to go home, that Coach would update us when he had information. That evening, I got a text from Coach saying Trevor had suffered a cardiac episode, that his parents were with him, that he was stable but would be out for the season. It was shocking but seemed like a freak medical event. Trevor was 17, healthy, an incredible athlete. But sometimes those things happened, or so we were told. What bothered me was how quickly Coach moved on. The next day at practice, he barely mentioned Trevor, just said we needed to adjust our rotation and keep focused on our goals. When I asked if we could visit Trevor in the hospital, Coach said his family wanted privacy. When I suggested we dedicate the season to him, Coach said Trevor wouldn't want us to be distracted by sentiment. It felt cold, but I rationalized it as Coach being focused on keeping our championship run alive. We were 3 weeks from regionals. Losing our emotional center could derail everything. I told myself Coach was protecting us from distraction. I was wrong about so many things. The second incident happened 3 weeks later, the week before regionals. Devin Wright, one of our middle blockers, started having severe anxiety attacks before matches. He'd be fine in practice, but the moment we arrived at a competition venue, he'd have difficulty breathing, his hands would shake, he'd become convinced he couldn't play. Coach Novak's response was to pull him aside before matches for private conversations that Devin wouldn't discuss afterward. Whatever coach said worked in the short term. Devin would emerge from those talks calm, focused, and would play brilliantly. But after matches, he'd be withdrawn and exhausted, not celebrating wins with the rest of us. I asked him once if everything was okay, if coach was putting too much pressure on him. Devin looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said, "Coach knows what's best. I just need to trust the process." The phrase sounded rehearsed, like something coach had told him to say. We won regionals easily, advancing to the state tournament. The victories should have felt triumphant, but something was off. The team's energy was strained. Guys who'd been friends for years were barely talking. Carlos had lost maybe 15 pounds, despite eating constantly. Jaden was missing easy sets he'd normally crush. Isaiah had dark circles under his eyes like he wasn't sleeping. Leo confided in me after one practice that coach had started calling him at home after 10 p.m. to discuss strategy, conversations that would stretch past midnight. When Leo had asked if they could talk during normal hours, coach had said elite athletes didn't keep normal hours, that Division I coaches would expect this kind of availability. Leo didn't complain again, but I saw how exhausted he was. I started paying closer attention to coach's behavior. The private meetings with individual players that happened in his office with the door closed. The way he'd pull guys aside during water breaks for intense conversations. The fact that he'd instituted a policy that players couldn't communicate with each other about what was discussed in those private sessions, claiming it was to prevent psychology being shared inappropriately. The mandatory supplement regimen he'd introduced in January, providing each player with pills and protein powders from unmarked bottles, saying they were specialized formulations designed for volleyball athletes. The increasing irritability when anyone questioned his methods. The way he'd remind us constantly that our success was entirely due to his coaching, that we'd be nothing without him. I wanted to talk to someone about my concerns. But who? The athletic director, Mr. Kenneth Sharp, was Coach Novak's closest ally in the administration. They'd worked together for 15 years. Sharp had approved every request Novak ever made, defended him against occasional parent complaints, and treated him like the school's most valuable asset. Going to parents seemed futile, since most of them worshipped Coach for getting their sons scholarship offers and college opportunities. My own parents had been so grateful when I'd earned interest from Division I programs that they'd framed Coach's recommendation letter and hung it in our living room. The idea of telling them I was suspicious of Coach felt impossible. The state championship was held in early March at the University Fieldhouse. We won in straight sets against 3 opponents, playing some of the best volleyball of our lives. Coach was jubilant, already talking about nationals, about how we were going to make history. The celebration in our locker room after winning state should have been pure joy, but it felt muted. When I looked around at my teammates, I saw exhaustion, stress, and something else I was only starting to recognize as fear. That night, lying in bed, unable to sleep despite being physically spent, I made a decision. I was going to find out what was really going on with our coach and our team, even if it meant risking everything I'd worked for. The investigation started simply. I called Trevor, whose number I'd kept even though Coach had discouraged us from maintaining contact. Trevor answered on the 3rd ring, his voice cautious. I asked him directly what had caused his collapse. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Alex, you need to be careful." That was my name, Alex Brennan, team captain, honor roll student, kid who'd never questioned authority in his life. I asked him what he meant. Trevor said he couldn't talk on the phone, but if I wanted to meet in person, he'd tell me everything. We met 2 days later at a coffee shop 30 minutes from Riverside, far enough that we wouldn't run into anyone from school. Trevor looked healthier than he had in months, actually. Color in his face, weight back on, the constant tension gone from his shoulders. He told me a story that made my blood run cold. Coach Novak had been giving him performance-enhancing drugs since the beginning of the season. Not the supplements he'd told everyone about, but actual steroids and stimulants designed to increase strength, endurance, and recovery. Trevor had thought they were legal vitamins and protein, supplements. Coach had been very careful about how he'd framed it, talking about cutting-edge sports nutrition, Olympic-level training methods, completely legal substances that just weren't widely known yet. Trevor had trusted him completely. The drugs had worked, improving Trevor's performance dramatically. But they'd also stressed his cardiovascular system to the point of cardiac episode. The doctors had found the substances in his blood work and informed his parents, who'd immediately pulled him from the team and were considering filing charges against Coach Novak. But they were being pressured by the school to stay quiet, threatened that Trevor's scholarship offers would be rescinded if word got out, told that ruining Coach's reputation would hurt hundreds of future students. I asked Trevor if he had proof. He pulled out his phone and showed me text messages from Coach discussing dosages and timing, instructions to take certain pills before matches, warnings not to tell anyone, because other teams would try to steal the training methods. The messages were coded, but clearly incriminating if you knew what they referred to. Trevor said at least 4 other players were being given the same substances, but he didn't know who. Coach compartmentalized everything, making sure players didn't compare notes. I asked why Trevor hadn't reported this immediately. He said he'd been too scared, that Coach had convinced him he'd be blamed for taking drugs voluntarily, that his athletic future would be destroyed, that his family would be devastated. The fear had been paralyzing until his parents had taken over. I spent the next week in a fog, going through the motions at school and practice while my brain processed what I'd learned. I watched Coach differently now, saw the manipulation clearly. The way he'd isolate vulnerable players, the private meetings where he'd create dependency and obligation, the threats disguised as concern. I'm worried about your scholarship. Chances if you don't commit fully to my program. Your family is counting on you to succeed. Don't let them down by being weak. Other players are working harder. You're falling behind. Every interaction was designed to create pressure, eliminate autonomy, and establish his absolute control. And it was working. These were 17 and 18-year-old kids, most from families where sports offered a path to college that academics alone wouldn't provide. Coach had positioned himself as the gatekeeper to their futures, and they believed him. I needed to confirm Trevor's account to verify that other players were being drugged. I started paying attention to the supplement distribution. Coach kept the unmarked bottles in his office and would call players in individually to pick up their personalized nutrition plans. I watched who went in and noticed a pattern. The starters, the players getting the most college interest, the ones Coach needed to perform at peak levels. Carlos, Jaden, Devin, Leo, and 2 others. Not the bench players or the less critical positions. Coach was strategic about it, maximizing impact while minimizing risk of exposure. I needed to get access to those bottles to confirm what was actually in them. Breaking into Coach's office felt like a violation of everything I'd been raised to believe about respect and rules, but I justified it as protecting my teammates from someone who'd already violated every ethical boundary imaginable. The opportunity came the following Friday when Coach had to attend an athletic directors conference across town. Practice was run by his assistant, a recent college graduate named Cody Williams, who was competent but lacked Coach's authoritarian presence. I volunteered to stay late to work on hitting drills, knowing Cody would leave by 6:30 when his shift officially ended. Sure enough, by 6:45, I was alone in the gym. Coach's office was technically locked, but I'd seen him use the key above the doorframe, dozens of times. It took me 30 seconds to get inside. The office was exactly what you'd expect from an obsessive coach. Walls covered with team photos, championship banners, newspaper clippings, filing cabinets full of player files and game statistics, and on his desk, a locked drawer that I opened using a paperclip and technique I'd learned from YouTube during a stupid phase in middle school when I'd thought lockpicking was cool. Inside the drawer were 6 unmarked bottles. I photographed the contents with my phone, noting the white and blue pills, the consistency that looked medical rather than nutritional. I took 1 pill from each bottle, wrapping them carefully in tissue and placing them in my backpack. Then I locked everything back up, replaced the key, and left the gym. My hands were shaking the entire drive home. I just committed theft and breaking and entering because I believed my coach was drugging players without informed consent. If I was wrong, my life was over. If I was right, Coach Novak's life was over. There was no middle ground here. The next morning, I researched labs that would test pharmaceutical samples without asking too many questions. I found a place 30 miles away that advertised anonymous drug testing for athletes. I drove there that afternoon, paid $400 from my savings, and submitted the pills for analysis. Results would take 3 to 5 business days. While waiting for the lab results, I started documenting everything else I'd noticed about Coach's behavior. The excessive practice hours that violated state athletic association guidelines, the way he'd prevented players from seeking outside medical treatment without his approval, the psychological manipulation tactics, the isolation of players from their families and support systems. I created a detailed timeline with dates, incidents, and witnesses. Leo noticed my obsessive note-taking one day at lunch and asked what I was working on. I told him the truth, all of it. Trevor's story, the office break-in, the lab tests pending. Leo stared at me for a long moment, then said quietly that Coach had been giving him pills too, that he'd been having heart palpitations and headaches, that he'd been too scared to tell anyone because Coach had said questioning the program meant Leo wasn't serious about his future. We decided to bring in Devin, Carlos, Jaden, and Isaiah. We met at my house on a Sunday afternoon when my parents were out. I explained everything. The room was silent as I laid out the evidence. Then, one by one, they started sharing their own experiences. Devin described the anxiety attacks that had started after he'd begun taking Coach's supplements, the way Coach had convinced him it was just performance pressure and that more supplements would help. Carlos talked about the weight loss, the inability to sleep, the constant jittery feeling. Jaden mentioned memory issues and mood swings. Isaiah, who hadn't been given supplements because liberos didn't need the same physical enhancement, described watching his teammates deteriorate while Coach kept pushing harder. By the end of the conversation, we had a clear picture. Coach Novak had been systematically drugging at least 5 starters with performance-enhancing substances, lying about what they were, and creating psychological dependency to prevent disclosure. The lab results came back on Wednesday. The pills contained stanozolol, an anabolic steroid, and methylphenidate, a powerful stimulant. Both were banned by the NCAA, illegal to possess without prescription, and dangerous when used without medical supervision. I now had documentary proof that Coach Novak was committing multiple felonies. The question was what to do with it. Going to the administration felt futile given Athletic Director Sharp's loyalty to Coach. Going to police felt terrifying, like we'd be destroying not just Coach, but potentially the entire volleyball program and our own athletic futures. The smartest move was probably hiring a lawyer, but that cost money none of us had. We were teenagers trying to expose institutional corruption perpetrated by an adult with power, connections, and 18 years of credibility. The odds felt impossibly stacked against us. Leo suggested we go to his mother, who was a nurse practitioner with experience in sports medicine. We met with her that evening, showing her the lab results and describing the symptoms players had experienced. Her reaction was immediate and furious. She said what Coach had done wasn't just unethical, it was criminal, that these drugs could cause permanent damage to developing bodies, that Trevor's cardiac episode could easily have been fatal. She said we needed to report this immediately to law enforcement and medical authorities. When we expressed fear about retaliation and our futures, she said our health and safety were more important than volleyball, and that any institution threatening us for exposing abuse deserved to be destroyed. Her certainty gave us courage. She made calls that evening to an attorney she knew who specialized in cases involving minors and institutional abuse. The attorney was named Gregory Shaw, a partner at Shaw & Associates with 23 years of experience prosecuting civil rights violations and educational misconduct. He met with us on Thursday evening, reviewed all our evidence, interviewed each player about their experiences, and explained our legal options. He said we had grounds for criminal charges against Coach Novak for drug distribution, child endangerment, and fraud. We had grounds for civil suits against the school district for negligent supervision and creating an unsafe environment. But he warned that pursuing legal action would be grueling, public, and potentially devastating to our personal lives. We'd be up against the school's lawyers, Coach's defenders in the community, and media scrutiny that would paint us as either heroes or villains, depending on who was telling the story. He asked us what outcome we actually wanted. That question stumped us. What did we want? Coach fired and prosecuted, obviously. The volleyball program cleaned up and made safe for future players. Recognition that what had happened was wrong. But beyond that, we didn't know. Some of us wanted to play college volleyball despite everything. Some just wanted the nightmare to stop. All of us wanted our senior season to mean something other than being victims of abuse. Shaw suggested a strategic approach. Gather more evidence, build an ironclad case, and then force the district's hand by making the information public in a way they couldn't ignore or suppress. He said the most powerful thing we could do was demonstrate unity as a team, show that this wasn't one disgruntled player making accusations, but an entire program standing together against their coach. That meant bringing in the other players, the ones who hadn't been drugged but had witnessed the toxic environment. We spent the next week carefully recruiting the rest of the team. Not everyone was immediately convinced. Some players loved Coach, believed in him, couldn't reconcile the mentor they knew with the criminal we were describing. Others had suspected something was wrong, but hadn't known how to address it. A few were terrified of retaliation and wanted to stay out of it entirely. But gradually, as we showed evidence and told our stories, a consensus emerged. All 12 varsity players agreed that what Coach had done was wrong, that the program had become unhealthy, and that something had to change. The question was how to force that change in a way the administration couldn't ignore. That's when someone suggested the forfeit. We were 2 weeks from Nationals, the biggest tournament of our lives, the culmination of everything we'd worked for. Our school had spent thousands of dollars on travel and lodging. Local media was covering our journey. The community was invested in our success. If we forfeited at Nationals in front of 8,000 people and streaming cameras broadcasting to thousands more, it would be impossible to hide. The question would be why, and we'd have the answer ready, because our coach had been drugging us without consent, creating an abusive environment, and prioritizing his legacy over our safety. The forfeit would be our protest, our testimony, and our revenge all in one act. It was perfect. It was terrifying. It was the only thing that felt powerful enough to match what had been done to us. Shaw advised us that a public forfeit would indeed generate massive attention, but would also paint targets on our backs. We'd be accused of being spoiled athletes, poor sports, ungrateful kids. Coach Novak's defenders would attack our credibility, our motives, our character. We'd need to be prepared with a clear, unified message and undeniable evidence. He helped us draft a statement explaining our reasons for forfeiting, listing specific facts about the drug distribution, the health consequences, and the culture of fear Coach had created. We agreed that Leo and I, as captains, would deliver the statement immediately after forfeiting. We'd provide copies to media, post it on social media, and give Shaw authorization to release our evidence to law enforcement simultaneously. It would be a coordinated exposure that left no room for the district to spin the narrative or protect Coach. The days leading up to Nationals were surreal. We continued practicing, preparing for a tournament we knew we wouldn't play. Coach was in peak form, confident and commanding, planning strategies for opponents we'd never face. He had no idea that every player on his team had turned against him, that we'd spent weeks building a case for his destruction, that his moment of greatest triumph was about to become his professional execution. Looking back, I felt something like pity for him. He'd built his entire identity around coaching, believed genuinely that his methods were justified by results, convinced himself that controlling every aspect of his players' lives was necessary for their development. He was delusional, criminal, and pathetic, and he was about to lose everything. We traveled to Nationals on Thursday, 3 days before the championship match. The tournament was held at a convention center in a city 4 hours away, a massive facility that hosted regional sporting events. The atmosphere was electric, teams from across the country competing for the national title. We were the favorite, the team everyone was watching, the program with the legendary coach and undefeated record. Media wanted interviews, spectators wanted autographs. The pressure was enormous, and for the first time it felt liberating rather than crushing because we knew none of it mattered. We went through the motions of preparation, attended team meetings, participated in warm-up sessions. Coach gave his usual speeches about legacy and commitment and seizing the moment. We nodded and acted focused, while internally counting down to Saturday at 6:47 p.m. when we destroy his legacy in front of the world. Friday, we played our semifinal match. We won in 4 sets, advancing to the championship. Coach was ecstatic, already preparing for Saturday's final, his championship number 5 within reach. That evening, the team met in Leo's hotel room for one final conversation. We reviewed the plan, confirmed everyone was committed, acknowledged that there was still time to back out if anyone had doubts. Nobody did. We'd come too far, learned too much, lost too much to back down now. Devin said something I'll never forget. Coach taught us that winning was about sacrifice and commitment to something bigger than ourselves. So, let's prove we learned that lesson by sacrificing this championship for something bigger, the truth. We spent that night writing individual statements about our experiences, creating a comprehensive record that would be released alongside our forfeit announcement. Saturday morning, I barely slept. I woke at 5 a.m., my stomach in knots, and spent an hour staring at the ceiling. This was it. In 14 hours, my volleyball career would effectively end, my reputation would be permanently altered, and Coach Novak's life would implode. Part of me wanted to play, to win, to have that championship memory. But a larger part knew that playing would be complicity, that stepping on that court while knowing what I knew would make me no better than the administrators who'd protected Coach and the systems that had enabled his abuse. At 9 a.m., we had our final team meeting. Coach went through the game plan, emphasizing specific matchups and strategies. He was brilliant, actually, his volleyball knowledge encyclopedic, his tactical mind sharp. In another universe where he'd been ethical, he would have been the mentor he'd claimed to be. Instead, he was a cautionary tale about how talent and success could mask monstrous behavior. The hours before the match crawled by. We arrived at the convention center at 4 p.m. for warm-up scheduled at 5:30. The facility was already packed, fans streaming in, wearing school colors, holding signs, the energy building toward the 6:47 start time. Our parents were there, most of them still unaware of what was about to happen. We'd agreed not to tell families in advance to protect them from being pressured to stop us. They'd find out when everyone else did. Shaw was positioned in the media section with copies of our statement and evidence ready to distribute. A local reporter Leo's mother knew personally was standing by to break the story immediately after our announcement. Everything was in place. At 6:30, we moved to our bench for final preparations. Coach gave his last speech, something about leaving everything on the court and making history. Then, the referee called for captains. Leo and I walked to center court, the Westfield captains, approached for the coin toss. The referee smiled, completely unaware he was about to witness something unprecedented. The crowd was roaring, cameras were rolling, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. I looked at Leo. He nodded. I turned to the referee and said, "Riverside High forfeits this match. We will not play." The silence that followed was deafening. Then the questions started. The referee asking if I was serious, the opposing captains looking confused. Coach Novak storming onto the court demanding to know what was happening. Tournament officials rushing over. The crowd's confused murmur building to a roar. Leo pulled out his phone and started reading our prepared statement into the chaos. His voice was steady and clear, carrying across the court as he explained exactly why we were forfeiting, naming Coach Novak specifically, detailing the drug distribution, the abuse, the cover-up. Coach's face went from confusion to rage to fear in about 30 seconds. He tried to interrupt, to stop Leo from speaking, but tournament officials held him back. The crowd was in uproar now, some people shouting support, others screaming that we were throwing away our futures, still others demanding answers from Coach. Media swarmed toward us. Our teammates left the bench and formed a wall around Leo and me, protecting us while the statement was completed. When Leo finished, I held up a folder containing printed copies of evidence and announced that everything would be provided to media and law enforcement immediately. Shaw appeared beside us, identifying himself as our attorney, confirming our statements were given freely and truthfully, and announcing that criminal complaints would be filed within the hour. The convention center descended into chaos. Security tried to restore order. Tournament officials were consulting frantically. Coach Novak was screaming that we were lying, that we'd destroyed our team for attention, that we'd regret this betrayal. Our parents were pushing through the crowd, some furious, some terrified, all demanding to know what was happening. Leo's mother reached us first and wrapped her arms around her son, tears streaming down her face. My own parents arrived moments later, my dad looking shell-shocked, my mom gripping my arm like I might disappear. I told them simply, Coach was drugging us. We had to stop him. The words felt inadequate for the enormity of what we'd just done, but they were true. Within an hour, local news had the story. Within 2 hours, it was on national sports networks. By that evening, it was trending on every social media platform. High school volleyball team forfeits national championship to expose coach's abuse was the headline across dozens of outlets. The coverage was mixed. Some praised our courage and integrity. Others accused us of being dramatic teenagers who destroyed a great coach's reputation over normal athletic rigor. Coach Novak's defenders emerged immediately, parents of former players who credited him with their son's success, administrators who insisted he'd always operated with complete ethics, and community members who felt we'd disgraced the school. But as Shaw released our evidence, the lab results, the text messages, Trevor's medical records, and testimonies from multiple players, the narrative shifted decisively in our favor. The county prosecutor, District Attorney Meredith Vance, with 19 years in the office, announced Monday morning that her office was opening a criminal investigation into Coach Graham Novak for drug distribution to minors, child endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy. Coach was placed on immediate administrative leave. Athletic Director Kenneth Sharp was also suspended pending investigation into whether he'd known about or enabled Coach's conduct. The school board called an emergency meeting and voted to hire an independent investigator, a former federal prosecutor named Dr. Leonard Gaines, to examine the entire athletic department's practices and culture. The investigation would take months, but the damage to Coach Novak's reputation was immediate and irreversible. Sponsors pulled their support. Media that had glorified him now ran exposés on his methods. Former players started coming forward with their own stories of abuse and manipulation that had been buried for years. The emotional aftermath was complicated. We were heroes to some, villains to others, and trauma survivors trying to process what we'd been through while living under constant public scrutiny. The forfeit had achieved its purpose, exposing Coach and forcing accountability, but it had cost us the championship we'd worked toward all season. Some teammates struggled with that loss more than others. Devin said he'd made peace with it because the forfeit felt like winning something more important than a trophy. Carlos said he'd probably always wonder what might have been if we'd just played and reported everything afterward. I felt both things simultaneously, proud of our courage and grieving for what we'd sacrificed. Therapy helped. Shaw connected us with Dr. Nina Alvarez, a psychologist specializing in athlete trauma and institutional abuse, who provided counseling for the entire team. The criminal case moved forward steadily. Coach Novak was indicted in May on 14 felony counts. His trial was scheduled for September. Before it began, he took a plea deal, guilty to 6 counts including drug distribution and child endangerment, in exchange for a recommended sentence of 8 years in prison and lifetime ban from coaching or working with minors. The judge accepted the plea, and in October, Coach Graham Novak was sentenced to 8 years in state prison. The courtroom was packed with former players, parents, media, and community members. The judge's statement was scathing, describing Coach as a predator who'd exploited his position of trust to serve his ego and ambition, causing psychological and physical harm to dozens of young people. Coach showed no emotion, no remorse, just the same controlled expression he'd worn on the bench. The only crack came when he was led away in handcuffs and turned back briefly to scan the courtroom, seeing all of us, his former players, watching his downfall with quiet satisfaction. The civil case was settled before trial. The school district, facing overwhelming evidence of negligence and exposure to massive damages, agreed to a settlement totaling $2.8 million distributed among the 12 players who'd been on the national championship team. The money was placed in trusts for college expenses. More importantly, the settlement required comprehensive reforms, mandatory independent oversight of all coaching staff, anonymous reporting systems for athlete complaints, regular medical monitoring by independent physicians, strict limits on practice hours and supplement distribution, and annual training on appropriate coach-athlete boundaries. The district also agreed to issue a public apology acknowledging systemic failures that had enabled Coach Novak's abuse. Athletic Director Sharp resigned rather than face termination proceedings. The new athletic director was a woman named Dr. Teresa Williams, with a background in athlete welfare and a stated commitment to prioritizing player safety over program prestige. The investigation by Dr. Gaines uncovered that Coach Novak's abuse had extended back at least 12 years, affecting an estimated 40 to 50 players over that period. Many had suffered in silence, believing their experiences were normal athletic training or that they'd be blamed if they spoke up. Some had developed serious health problems, including heart issues, liver damage, and psychological conditions. The report recommended not just institutional changes, but also creation of a support fund for former players seeking medical treatment or therapy. The community was forced to reckon with uncomfortable truths about how they'd enabled the abuse by worshiping success without questioning methods, how they'd silenced concerns to protect a winning program, and how they'd valued championships over children's welfare. My own future unfolded unexpectedly. The publicity around the forfeit and subsequent case generated interest from colleges that appreciated our integrity and courage. I received scholarship offers from several Division I programs whose coaches explicitly said they wanted players who would stand up for what was right. I accepted an offer from a school on the West Coast with a strong volleyball program and a coach whose ethics I'd thoroughly researched. Leo went to a different school, but we stayed close friends, bonded by what we'd been through together. Most of our teammates also received college opportunities, their athletic careers continuing despite the unconventional end to our high school journey. Trevor, whose cardiac episode had started everything, made a full recovery and walked onto his college team as a non-scholarship player, earning a roster spot through sheer determination. The forfeit became something larger than just our story. It was used in ethics courses discussing moral courage and whistleblowing. Sports management programs studied it as a case of institutional failure and reform. Coaching certification programs incorporated lessons about appropriate boundaries and athlete welfare. The video of our forfeit, shaky footage filmed on someone's phone as we stood united on that court refusing to play, circulated online and became a symbol of athlete empowerment. We'd proven that players had power beyond just performing when we chose to use that power collectively. The lesson resonated far beyond volleyball, inspiring other athletes to speak up about abusive conditions in their own programs. Looking back now, 2 years later, I'm still processing what happened. The forfeit was simultaneously the hardest decision I've ever made and the most obvious. How could we have played knowing what we knew? How could we have accepted that championship under those circumstances? The answer is, we couldn't. Not without betraying everything sports were supposed to teach us about integrity, teamwork, and doing the right thing even when it's costly. Coach Novak had taught us those lessons ironically by being their opposite, by showing us what corruption looked like so clearly that we had no choice but to reject it. In trying to build his legacy through us, he'd created the people who would destroy him. There's poetry in that. The championship we forfeited would have been my crowning athletic achievement, the highlight I could have pointed to for the rest of my life as proof of excellence and dedication. Instead, I have something different. The memory of standing on that court, saying no, watching everything we'd worked for dissolve while knowing we'd done the right thing. That memory is harder to carry, more complicated to explain, less impressive on a resume. But it's real in a way that trophy never could have been. We didn't win that day in the traditional sense. We sacrificed, we exposed, we changed things for people who'd come after us. We proved that teenagers could take down powerful adults when we had evidence, unity, and courage. We demonstrated that forfeiting can be a form of winning when the game itself has become corrupted. If I had to make the choice again, knowing everything I know now, I'd still forfeit. Every time. Because some victories are worth more than championships. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.